it's an honor and a privilege to introduce the next person up here. Jerry Cohon is, if I get this all right, President Emeritus, University Professor, and Director of the Scott Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, and has been involved with a number of critical issues in this region for years, partnerships with Pitt over years that really transformed the region, but also work on stormwater issues, on shale gas issues, and with the Scott Institute on a lot of these energy issues that we're talking about. And Jerry's going to give us a few remarks and then introduce our speaker. So, Dr. Cohon, sir.
Thank you, David, very much. The Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, which I direct, is a co-sponsor of this event. This is what you get as a result of our co-sponsoring. You have to listen to me for about 5 minutes or so before we get to what I'm sure is going to be a terrific talk. I'll be quick about it. Congratulations to David and his colleagues on pulling together a terrific program, and congratulations and thanks to those of you who've traveled here from the Northeast. I'm impressed that many of you, in fact, could make it. Not surprisingly, the theme of this conference connects very strongly to much of what CMU does in this area. I say not surprisingly because of the strong representation of Carnegie Mellon at this conference. I'm sorry I missed Neil's and Granger's talks this morning. I heard they were terrific. I've heard them talk before, so I'm not surprised to hear that they were terrific, but thank you for doing it. Indeed, pathways to a low-carbon future is one of the major priority areas that the Scott Institute focuses on. That in and of itself is a policy and technology challenge, but also we focus on some of the technologies and policy sub-issues that are a key part to finding a pathway to a low-carbon future. Efficiency is one of the major thrusts that we focus on, and technologies to help that happen, especially energy storage technologies. The Scott Institute was created 5 years ago as a result of two large gifts, one from Sherman and Joyce Scott to alumni, and another from the Richard King Mellon Foundation, for which we're very grateful. Granger was the founding director of the Scott Institute. I was president at the time. And Granger, being the busy guy that he was and is, needed some convincing to take on the directorship. It's the last thing he needed. And I made a promise to him that when I stepped down from the presidency, which we already knew was going to be 2 years later, I would succeed him as director if he still wanted me to. Well, I stepped down and he didn't forget the promise, and I became director. But I'll be stepping down on May 1st to be succeeded by Jay Whitaker, a really brilliant young faculty member who's going to take the Scott Institute to the next level. I'm also up here to promote something, Energy Week. Carnegie Mellon's second annual Energy Week is the last week of March, so week after next. It's a terrific, very dense week, dense in the sense of a lot going on, major events every day, significant speakers, excellent panels. The entire week is worth your while. If you just visit the CMU homepage, you'll see a link to the Scott Institute, and that will take you to a complete description of the program and a way to register. I want to draw your attention, though, to two events during that week for your consideration. On Wednesday afternoon, we have a series of short research talks by selected faculty, which we call, instead of TED Talks, we call them Andy Talks, as in Andrew Carnegie. These are terrific, and you really enjoy it, and you get a very efficient dive into what Carnegie Mellon is doing at the moment in terms of the research that we're doing. The other one I want you to be aware of is on Friday of that week. It is a joint effort with the University of Pittsburgh, Law School and West Virginia University Law School on energy policy and law. We've got some very high-profile speakers coming. The Deputy Administrator of the EIA, the Chair of the Pennsylvania PUC, and a FERC Commissioner, among many others, including faculty. It's going to be a terrific program. So Wednesday and Friday, please visit our web page and check it out. We hope you'll join us. It's my pleasure to introduce to you David Titley. David is at Penn State, where he's director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. He has a bachelor's from Penn State. He went on to get a PhD from the Naval Postgraduate School and had a very impressive career in the Navy over a 32-year period, rising to the highest ranks before he retired. There are two things in particular in his career that are really significant for our purposes today. One, while he was in the Navy, he started the Navy's task force on climate change and led it. And after retiring from the Navy, he served as Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce and COO of NOAA. So he's got outstanding experience, great knowledge. I'll say no more, so we leave as much time as we can for David Titley. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks so much. Okay. All right, thanks very much. No, I'm not texting or playing with my phone up here, but it turns out there's no clock. And my guess is you guys would be happy if I finished before 4 p.m. or something like that for the lunchtime talk. So this will hopefully be pretty quick. It is not directly related to deep carbon reductions in Pennsylvania, but the work you're doing here is frankly very fundamental to getting to the root cause of managing climate as a security risk. So when I talk to the Pentagon, most of what we talk about is how do you adapt to the changing climate, because it's coming whether you want it or not. And if we can get them on board with that, and by and large they are, then that's useful. The Pentagon, I would say, is not going to be the one that everybody should look to somehow magically figure out how the rest of us are going to get to zero or near zero carbon reductions. They can be a partner, but I would caution people sort of dumping new missions onto the Pentagon. Believe it or not, they're not looking for new missions here, and they're really not the right people to do it in any sense. So with that, let me talk to you about kind of how I think about climate as a security risk. You may or may not have heard that, and we'll go from there. So just a little bit of background about me. I am not a climate scientist. I don't pretend to be one. I don't play one on TV. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn. This is actually a rain gauge, believe it or not. It's from when I was 9 years old. It was my pride and possession. I'm really a lifelong meteorologist, lifelong meaning since probably about kindergarten or so. And that's really all I wanted to do in life was forecast weather. That's not me at Penn State when I was an undergrad, but it kind of could have been because we were mostly in the paper chart business. And as mentioned, I then ended up in the Navy, mostly because I needed a way to pay to go to Penn State. So that worked out. I thought I was going to be in for 4 years. 32 years later, I finally left. Sometimes it works out that way. And as was mentioned, I then had the honor and opportunity to be NOAA's chief operating officer for a little while after I left. And now I'm up at Penn State. And you know, for what we're doing here, it's kind of nice that we have both meteorology and really some really good climate folks. And somehow we talk and we can sort of work the intersection there. And there's a lot of exciting stuff going on at that intersection. So yes, I'm going to talk about climate, but I would just ask, and I think everybody here knows that this is not just about climate. You know, climate is one of, but not the only by any means, really driving issue of this coming century. Everybody wants, and I would argue has some degree of right to, adequate food, adequate water, adequate energy. They're usually tied together, especially around water. Whether we like it or not, we are fundamentally a globalized world now. So what happens for climate and extreme weather impacts in Thailand can and does impact the United States economy. So technology marches on. My students probably think I have the phone on the left, but I traded it out about 2 weeks ago, so I don't anymore. I might add a microwave to this slide now, too, that's listening to it. No, never mind. We won't put a microwave on there. Technology does a lot of things. And I don't think we've completely thought them through, but one of the things it does, and we're seeing this play out day by day, is it forces transparency, whether we want to or not. So really the decisions we make, be it as Pennsylvania on how, whether, and at what rate we decarbonize, to military decisions, to really national and international policy on how we choose or choose not to manage this climate risk, everybody's going to know. It's not going to stay inside of some smoke-filled room in the back somewhere. Everybody's going to know whether you want them to or not. And of course, the population keeps on going up. So we're going to deal with this. You know, sometimes I get told, well, you know, climate's changed before with people, and that's true. But when the world population is 1 or 2 million, that's a whole lot of difference than a world of 6, 7, 8, 9 billion people. And we also tell ourselves we're out of money. And we heard on some of the earlier discussions already today, investments in economics, in fact, do matter. So at the national level and international level, you know, we tell ourselves we're out of money. So you've had from Neil and Granger touched on it, as well as some of the panelists, the other panelists, some really tremendous talks about the basic science. I'm not going to give you any of the science here. I will tell you, almost a decade ago, when I was asked by the head of the Navy to look at this, I kind of looked at this almost as actually one of my favorite jobs in the Navy, and that was as navigator. And it was on this old destroyer you see down at the bottom right there. Probably about half the audience remembers there was a world in which, in fact, there was no GPS. You did not pick this thing up, and it told you where you were in the world within 2 meters. So I actually know how to use one of these things, a sextant. And one of the things you learn as navigator, unless you want to work at Walmart the next week, is pay attention to all the observations and all the evidence, if you will, but don't necessarily lock on to one thing 100%. Use that stuff in between your ears and kind of do that conceptual analysis. And that's really, frankly, how I approached really looking at climate as a risk for the Navy. And again, we could spend a whole week on the evidence. It is overwhelming. Neil walked you through very nicely how the carbon dioxide is increasing. No, there's not a test. But when I talked about this in the Pentagon, sometimes people would say, my God, Titley, did you get religion? And I said, well, I just went to the Church of the Radiative Transfer Equation. It's pretty well known, and you know, it's well known to the point where it's way over 150 years old. Guys like Fourier and Arnhus on the far right there, they did not, so we've known this stuff for really 100, 150 plus years. And we understand the theory, we understand the observations, and contrary to sometimes what you hear, we actually can predict the future in the climate on the broad scale very well. Frankly, don't let the intelligence community know this, way better than they can. And there's a reason for that. All we're dealing with is nonlinear fluid mechanics with, kind of crappy initial and boundary conditions. They have to deal with people. And that's a whole lot harder, and especially if they're people who want to deceive you. So relative to how our country plans for much of the future, the climate community has a way better insight as to what that future is going to look like than many other, be it economists, be it intelligence professionals, political scientists, not because we're particularly smarter, well, maybe, but it's really because we're dealing with physics and not with people. And that's kind of an important thing. So really just quickly, climate risk, the way I think about it, because who has time to read through the 1 meter stack of IPCC reports, I try to put it fairly simply. And I think about it as people, as water, and as change. I say people because a lot of times the climate does get framed as an environmental issue, and usually when it's framed as an environmental issue, you think of not of polar bear plunges, but what? That poor, lonely polar bear floating out in the Arctic. I have nothing against the polar bears. I have absolutely nothing against the environment. But do you think we're really going to, frankly, fundamentally change the world's energy system for the polar bears? And I would argue if we were, we would have started that quite a long time ago, and we haven't. So I don't think that's really the right framing. But it is about us. It's about all of us here, you and me, our family, our parents, our children, our grandchildren, people in our towns, people in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, even State College. We're all gonna be impacted by this. Water is arguably a pretty good integrating principle. It's not that we're going to all run out of water, but it gets fundamentally redistributed. And I tell people it's too much and too little, wrong place, wrong time. It's salty where it used to be fresh. It's liquid where it used to be solid. Your feet are now wet where they used to be dry. Those are some pretty big changes. And even the chemistry of the ocean itself is changing. And Neil told us why. It's because the oceans are taking up almost half of the CO2. And if there's anything about climate change that scares me, it's not the climate piece. Anybody here from either San Diego or Hawaii? Okay. They're the only places I know that have ideal climate. You know, we're in Pittsburgh. Look outside. I'm in State College. I don't see the sun for 4 months out of the year. But it's the change part. We've had, while we may not have all had ideal climate, we've had stable climate. So we've known when to plant, we've known when to harvest, we know what grows, we know what critters stay south of us so we don't have to worry about them. We know if we build a port like New York or Boston or London that the rivers and the ocean basically stays where they are, so we can build on that. If you think about it, we have built civilization on the implicit premise of climate stability for the last 8,000 years, because we've been in between the ice ages. We've had climate stability. And now we are changing it, and we are changing it very, very rapidly, arguably as rapid or more rapidly than the Earth has ever experienced climate change before. And we're going to do it with those 6, 7, 8 billion people. Okay, when you sort of step it down to why does the DoD care? Is this still like something else? The Department of Defense cares because it changes the very operating environment. The Arctic is probably the poster child for that, but it's not only the Arctic. Our infrastructure changes. So I was from the Navy. You know, we tend to put most of our bases at sea level. It's kind of a ship thing. So if the sea level changes, you know, we're not the Air Force. I can't just put everything in Minot, North Dakota. I said that once, and in the back of the room, it was sure enough, the city manager of Minot, North Dakota was there. I kid you not. You know, he invited the Navy to come, but I'm not sure we're going to take him up on that offer. And then finally, the fact that the climate is changing and that we are seeing increases in droughts, and when it rains harder, and yes, it sounds like a paradox, but it's actually, this is the way it's going to be, can make places in the world that are already not great, think Syria, think North Africa, and potentially push them over the edge, if you will. And we've seen the tragedy of the catastrophe that is Syria. There is a climate link to that. It didn't just cause it. It's not if then, but there is a climate link. So that's why fundamentally the US Navy, most militaries around the world actually are paying attention to climate. It changes the environment, it impacts their own infrastructure, and it can make bad things worse. So in the Arctic, and I'm afraid this is just not going to, well, let me try. Nope, it's not going to play today. I apologize for that. But what I was going to show you is really how the Arctic ice is frankly disappearing. It's not only disappearing in the extent, but it's disappearing in its volume. As recent as maybe 15 years ago, still 40–50% of the Arctic was covered by what we call multi-year ice, hard, thick ice. That number's gone down to 10 or 15%. That, ladies and gents, is basically a state change. It's a state change in what's in the Arctic. What that does, and again, we could talk all afternoon about the impacts of that, but sort of the bottom line is this engenders all kinds of human activity that just 20, 25 years ago we wouldn't have been thinking about, be it tourism on a large scale, be it resource extraction, not only fossil fuels, but also minerals. Ultimately, do the shipping routes change? Now, that's probably still at least 10, 15, 20 years in the future, but the shipping routes will likely change when we have reliably ice-free summers, and those are coming. All the way to, how do we deal with, there are still a couple territorial issues in the Arctic. So those are the things people usually think about. I'll just show you a couple slides of things in the Arctic that people don't always think about. This is not out of episode 2 of Star Wars, but this is actually up on the island of Svalbard, Norway. I apologize for the graphic, but it's actually in the lower right, if you see where Norway is, sort of that peninsula. Svalbard is that island almost off of Greenland. It's about 80 degrees north. I'll bet a couple people at least have been up there. One of the things that Svalbard has is the ability to basically monitor every single polar orbiting satellite on every single orbit. And it's because they go over the pole, of course, so they don't all go over the NASA stations at, like, say, Wallops Island or Singapore or anything like that, but they all go over Svalbard, and you can basically monitor and control space from Svalbard. It's Norwegian, but there's something called the Treaty of Svalbard. So while the Norwegians say they have sovereignty, there is a treaty that says anybody can be there. So the Russians have a research station there. The Chinese have research stations on Svalbard. Lots of people do. The Americans do not. We probably should, actually. The waters off Svalbard, nobody's really defined who has them. And this is a place the Russians like to push on. So we visited Svalbard, and a week later, the deputy prime minister, who had been banned by sanctions for visit any place in Europe, shows up. And you know how the Norwegians found out he was on Svalbard? TV. And you know what the Russians said? Deal with it. So you're only about 1 or 2 miscalculations away from something kind of going pretty bad here. Norway's a NATO member. You start invoking Article 5. Do we really start a serious conflict with one of our best, not with, but in support of one of our best NATO allies because of this ambiguity up here in the Arctic? And it's not just a rock, it's a rock with a lot of strategic importance. So that's one thing that not a ton of people think about. Another one, Greenland. Greenland, of course, right now is a territory, although a self-governing territory of Denmark, but there's a lot of people on Greenland who want to be independent, and they're looking for ways to do it. Up until the oil and gas price collapse, they were looking at fossil fuel extraction. Now they're looking at uranium. Who's going to do that? Is that going to be the Chinese? The Chinese have put a lot of money already into Greenland. That changes a lot of the geopolitics quite a bit. So I'm not saying if that's good or bad, but these are things that we should probably be thinking through in this fundamentally changed Arctic. Other things, I talked about infrastructure. So, again, without putting the obligatory picture of Bangladesh up here, here are a couple things that the military cares about. On the left, that's the island of someplace called Diego Garcia. My guess is about half the people have heard of it here. Little tiny atoll in the just south of the equator to the south and west of India. It is, if there's a middle of nowhere in the Indian Ocean, this is it. But it's British territory, but the Brits let the U.S. military do quite literally anything we want to do there as long as we're nice to the birds and the fish and the turtles. So we're nice to the birds and the fish and the turtles. Every significant Department of Defense operation in Southwest Asia in the last, I would say, 40 years has used in some way, shape, or form that island. It's about 1 to 2 meters on a good day above sea level. What happens when that goes? When I was in the Pentagon and I asked that question, usually the person I was having the meeting with looked at their watch and realized they had an urgent meeting someplace else and wanted to stop. Because we don't have a good answer. But I'll tell you, the answer is going to come with a cost, and it's going to be in the Bs. It's not going to be millions. In the top right there, that's the Air Force is building a space fund. That's great. We need to know what's up in space. Totally support that. That's wonderful. That's the island of Kwajalein. They're going to put one of their upward-looking radars on Kwajalein. All sounds good. Did a 250-page environmental impact study. Guess what they never looked at? Sea level. So some, postdoc says, hey, guess what? Your 50-year project there, well, it's going to last about 20 if we're lucky. So now the contractors are pointing at the Air Force, who points at the acquisition community, who points at everybody else to say, well, it wasn't really our fault. That's $1 billion, ladies and gents, that we probably have kind of screwed up there. And then my picture on the lower right there, this is my no good deed goes unpunished slide. This is Norfolk Naval Base. No kidding, that is Norfolk Naval Base. Hurricane's coming up. Navy Oceanography sees this. We get the ships all out on time. So what happens? That means these sailors kiss their spouses goodbye, wish them luck with the hurricane, go down to the piers, and drive the ships out. Nobody thought about the fact that the piers were going to now be under 2+ meters of water, and smaller and weaker hurricanes are causing basically the same effect. So they kind of got caught by surprise. And Norfolk is kind of ground zero for sea level rise there, so we care. I mentioned the geostrategic risk. Syria really is quite a long story. Starts actually 45 years ago with Assad coming in. He wanted to be self-sufficient in wheat. Now, you would hope that you would have advisors saying, hey, boss, we're in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's kind of a dry place. Maybe this isn't the smartest thing. But I think the advisors, because they stayed as advisors, said, President, you are a smart, powerful, and handsome man, and that is a great idea. We'll get right on it. And they did. And they became self-sufficient in wheat. But they did it by draining the aquifers and draining their rivers. That's great right up until it isn't. So you end up then with a couple droughts. Then you have the Iraq War, nothing to do with climate whatsoever, but it dumps 1 million people into the country of refugees. Then you have a really big drought, which does have a climate fingerprint on it, and now your farmers, your own farmers, have nothing. Now, this is Assad. It's not like he specializes in taking care of his people. So now you have almost 1.75 million desperate people between refugees and internally displaced persons with nothing. And then you get groups like Al-Qaeda Syria, like Al-Qaeda Iraq, which became into ISIS. It says, we'll take care of your family. We will feed you. We will give you water for you and your wife and your kids. It's easy for us to all sit here. We've had our lunch. We're kind of full. Says, well, geez, why would you do that? If you have nothing, that's a hard choice. And they're able to recruit. So can you predict that out of climate change? I would argue probably not. But you can say that the risk of things going south in a hurry goes way up when you already have unstable and not great governance, such as Syria, and then you add a climate component. So I talk about this as a link in a causal chain, and happy to talk offline if there's any more questions. So let me wrap up here just with really some solutions. And yes, this is a super boring picture. I know that. It's something called a Department of Defense directive. It's actually online. It hasn't disappeared yet. And it's really good. And if the Department of Defense actually does this was signed out about a year ago, it would really be good. We'll see if they do it. I don't know if you've heard or not, but it's actually in the news right now that Secretary Mattis, in response to questions from his congressional testimony, written questions, he basically said, hey, climate is one of the risks I've got to deal with. And that's tremendous because he's in the cabinet, and of course that is what we understand, not the position of every other cabinet member in this administration. But Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, is kind of calling, facts on the ground. And he sees this as an issue, and he is now on the record to the Congress as that is. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for that. Granger kind of mentioned this, or at least alluded to this. This is the "we can't do this ourselves" slide. It's the counterpart, if you will, to there is no silver bullet. There's no one magic person who's going to fix this. It's a teamwork issue, and it's a leadership issue. So I just have some pictures of people, not only military, but civilians, in the Department of Defense who have been instrumental in leading this effort. And it takes leadership. It takes leadership from the top to move this. Now, the bottom, us, we can help tell our leaders that we want that leadership, and that's what we're going to reward. But it will take leadership. I'll just kind of just about close with these. You can read these comments, but both Admiral Nimitz and Secretary Shultz, who we've already heard about a little bit this morning, I don't think either would be really characterized as either hardcore environmentalists or tree huggers or anything. but they both have had to, in their respective careers, manage very, very large risks. I would argue World War II in the Pacific was a pretty large risk. Secretary Shultz, in addition to, we all think of him as Secretary of State, he was also Director of Office of Management and Budget, so he kind of understands money. And they both understand taking out, whether you call it insurance policies or taking precautions. We need to do that, and we need to do that soon. It is this probabilities and risk. Granger already talked about that, what I have that circled there, this whole called climate intervention. There are some ways this can go south in a hurry, especially if we start putting a whole bunch of stuff into the upper atmosphere. But we may decide that's a lesser risk than what we're going to go through. We may get to the point where there are no great answers here. The top left is the Russians' very substantial military buildup in the Arctic. And a lot of this risk, unfortunately, is what we call fat tail. I wish it wasn't, but it is. So let me just close with, this is a little bit esoteric. I'll just show you kind of a personal example. When I was running the Navy's operational ocean and weather prediction capabilities, that's based down in a place called Stennis Space Center. It's right on the Mississippi-Louisiana border, right on the coast. So this was a house we lived in, my family, in a place called Waveland, Mississippi, almost to Louisiana, but not quite. And if you ever wonder what a 9-meter storm surge does going up your street, that's our house after Katrina. So when we say we lost our house, we have quite literally lost our house. We have no idea to this day whether it went all the way up the street and into the railway tracks or if it went out into the Gulf of Mexico. But it's not like I cleaned up for a month and that's what it looked like. That's how it was when I found it. So that was actually, in a way, kind of good. The other thing in there, if you see on the right-hand side, you sort of see that concrete and brick stuff. That was the ugliest house on the street. So I'm happy that I think my house came off its foundations, knocked down the ugly house, and that's okay too. So I'm okay with that. I don't show you this for sympathy or pity. I tell people we were actually about the luckiest people on the Gulf Coast. We had insurance, and for a very long story that I won't tell here, we had very few of our possessions in that house on that day. So we were incredibly lucky. But you should ask yourself what happens with these kind of storm surges, because as the seas come up, more and more storms, you don't even have to assume that storms are getting stronger. Just take what we have today. More and more storms will do this kind of damage. And if you do that to a lot of people who have nothing and the government doesn't take care of them and there is no plan B, then you can very easily have some very bad security situations that go south in a hurry, in addition to the whole moral aspect, which again could be another thing for another day. So this gentleman here was alleged to have said, I'm pretty sure he didn't, because it turns out Churchill never said anything as historians look at him, but he was alleged to have said that Americans can always be counted upon to do the right thing after exhausting every other possibility. So I guess we're going to maybe exhaust some more possibilities for a little bit longer, but I hope not. I really hope not. I think there is, although it doesn't look particularly optimistic right now, there is always a chance for sort of a Nixon to China moment. The fact that Secretary Mattis and some others, I think, do understand the risk. We don't know how this will play out, but I would certainly ask that we all certainly express how we feel to our elected officials. I tell people Congress will not lead on this, but they can be led, and they'll be led by us. They do know who their boss is, and it's us, and that will help. Okay, well, thanks very much, and I'm happy to either answer questions or move on to our next event, whatever you would like. Thank you very much. Okay, great.